I am Colby Sumner, and this is America, Fog of War.
Pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
I can hear you! I can hear you! The rest of the world hears you! And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it.
We're told that on his body was found a diary. Under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore, I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us again for another Hip Pocket History. I am Colby Sumner, and as always, I am joined by my co-host Brett Thomas. How you doing, buddy?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. Very excited for this part of the series.
Yeah, man. We're getting into the naval stuff here, and I mean, I feel like a duck out of water, you know?
Yeah, there's so much involved.
As Forrest Gump would say.
Yeah.
But no, it's you know, I've always been fascinated with land warfare growing up. That was what we did in the Marine Corps, land warfare, even though we're amphibious, as they've so often reminded us.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, you know, naval warfare, I really am out of my element, but I find it fascinating. You know, it hasn't really been since World War II that we've had big naval battles, or haven't seen, I guess, conventional warfare on a scale where it encompasses like the naval arms of countries, right?
Yeah.
It's all been land focused. We get to see like our modern Navy and how it's handling, you know, stuff over with Israel and the whole Palestine conflict. And we've seen it, you know, a few different instances, but really we have not seen, you know, a major power face off against another major power on the open seas. And you talk about a fascinating thing. You know, we were in here watching. I every once in a while I'll get on YouTube. I'll get like these videos of crazy things that happen out on the ocean, and the ocean is a terrifying thing. First off, it's so freaking big. It is humbling to say the least when you get out on a boat and you just see nothing but blue all around you, and then you know you're playing with the elements too. Mother Nature can be a cruel power to have to deal with.
Of course, yeah.
That you know you get rogue waves and all these storms, all this different stuff, and to consider the technology at the time that this is going to be taking place in 1942. You don't have like the great eye in the sky that you do now. You know, you get out in the Pacific Ocean, dude, and things just disappear. You can't see your enemy; they can't see you. It's a crazy environment to have to conduct warfare in. And today we're going to be covering one of the first major naval battles that leads to probably the largest naval battle, at least in America's history, if not the history of the world. And that's the Battle of the Coral Sea. And it's unique because it's not only is it up to this point one of the larger battles of the war as far as naval warfare goes, it is the first carrier-on-carrier action that we're going to see.
Yes.
And this gets us into some pretty interesting territory. I just want to warn the listeners and the viewers, this battle is super, super complicated and confusing. Pieces are moving all over the place. We're going to try to keep it as Barney style as possible when we explain where people are and when things happen, but it can get very complicated very quickly because they're trying to find each other. You look at a map of this, and you can clearly tell no one knows where anybody is. And this is over the course of a few days, so
Yeah,
we'll try to keep it as digestible as possible. But the important thing to start off with, as far as the U.S.'s plan, we've mentioned this before. As far as the U.S.'s plan to deal with Japan if a war broke out, was this War Plan Orange that we've mentioned in the first episode of this series, and that started back before World War I. And the idea at that time and for a long time, pretty much up to the war starting, was that it was going to be what we would call a surface naval conflict, right? So like surface fleets, which would be battleships and destroyers, ship on ship action, right? And the idea is that if a war kicked off, it would most likely happen in the Philippines, is where the Japanese would make their attack. In the U.S. surface fleet, which would be the fleet that was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, would meet up at Pearl Harbor, leave from there, head west across the Pacific towards the Philippines, encounter the Japanese fleet, and have this big, knockdown, drag-it-out fight with the Japanese Navy and come away the victor. Well, with the attack at Pearl Harbor, that changes a lot of things.
Changes things tremendously.
So there's a few things to cover here. We mentioned also in that first episode of this series, the one where we cover everything up to Pearl Harbor, a few days before the attack at Pearl Harbor, there's going to be a war warning sent to the naval commander there at the base.
Yeah.
And we kind of alluded that nothing really happened, but something actually does happen. He gets that order, and at this point in time, there are 4 carriers in the Pacific Fleet, 4 aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
2 of which are off doing something. So the first of those is going to be the Saratoga, which is actually back at Washington State. It's getting refitted and updated in some way. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but I know that it's back in Washington State, and it's getting refitted for future conflicts. The other ship, the USS Yorktown, has actually been sent from the Pacific to the Atlantic to link up with the Royal Navy to hunt German U-boats.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I want to look more into that. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is we're not even in the war yet, so I didn't know that was something that was going on. It'd be interesting to see how that came about. But 2 of the 4 carriers are out of the theater entirely. The remaining 2, as soon as that war order comes in, one is going to be sent to Midway Island and one is going to be sent to Wake Island to help hold those very strategic and important islands for the U.S. Now, since then, we've covered what has transpired at Wake Island. Those 2 ships eventually link up. They're going to be on the relief effort that's heading towards Wake Island, and then word gets back that there's a Japanese carrier in the area of Wake Island, and they cancel a mission, turn around, and head back towards Pearl.
Yep.
All that to be said is that when the Japanese do attack Pearl Harbor, and they pretty much decimate our surface fleet, right? So our destroyers and battleships, I think there's 4 ships destroyed.
Yeah.
Possibly 5.
And many damaged.
Many damaged. It's terrible. The loss of life is terrible, but it's not as bad as everybody thinks it's going to be, because the most important arm, or the most important asset we have in naval warfare, especially in the Pacific, hasn't been touched.
Yeah, wasn't even there.
Wasn't there.
Good.
Which you can boil that down to sheer luck. You can boil that down to good planning, whether that's on the admiral that was in charge of sending those carriers off to begin with. Whatever the case is, we still have our most valuable asset in naval warfare. And it's these carriers. So that leads us into what's going on in the Pacific at this point. So we've already kind of covered the fact that the Japanese have taken over astronomical amounts of area across the Pacific, and now their new goal is going to be a port on New Guinea called Port Moresby, and this is directly north of Australia. And their goal in taking this is it's the only naval supply route that the U.S. has left open, is directly towards Australia and then going in through Port Moresby. If the Japanese seize Port Moresby, they can cut Australia off from the U.S., and really the only place the U.S. has to launch operations from after that is Pearl Harbor, which is a long freaking ways away from anything else in the Pacific. You have a very interesting fact about Pearl Harbor to Japan. What is that?
Oh yeah, the vast size in comparison to what's been going on over in the European theater. So take London to Berlin, for example, and then take Honolulu, Hawaii to Japan. The size difference is 6 times greater in the Pacific.
So London to Berlin is 1/6 the size
of what they're dealing with between Honolulu to Japan.
That's insane.
It
dude.
is a much greater scale.
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
That is huge. And that's just as the bird flies, right? You're not talking about north and south and all the other area that you have to cover on the peripheries of that flight,
Your
right?
South Pacific,
That's just
Southwest Pacific, all the
that's
other.
just directly from one to the other.
Yeah.
It would be a real problem, not just for the Australian people if the Japanese seize that port in New Guinea, because right at that moment, the Japanese already have control of the northern part of New Guinea, right? But they can't cross the mountain range that spans the center part of the island. It's too treacherous. There's Australian jungle fighters that are really putting up a very strong resistance. So they think, well, we're just going to skirt around the side and hit this Port Moresby, take it from there, and the island is ours. Pretty soon to follow, Australia will be ours, and we can most definitely cut off that supply line. So the U.S. has to stop that. And this gets us into code breaking, which is another very fascinating aspect of this that I wish we could go into more detail on. But needless to say, at the start of the war, there's more than one code. There's more than one Japanese code. And if you've ever seen the movie Pearl Harbor, when they crack this Japanese code and they know that there is an imminent attack, right? That something is coming. That's what is called the diplomatic code.
Yeah.
Either Code Purple or Code Magic. It's been referenced by a few different names. Needless to say, it's what embassies, Japanese embassies, would be using essentially, right? So it's not an operational military code. It's a political code, a government code.
Yeah.
But it gives them enough information to know that something is going on. That's how they're able to get this war warning out. Now, as soon as the attack at Pearl Harbor happens, those code breakers immediately go to work on trying to crack the Japanese military's operational code. And that goes by the name JN25, or it's sometimes this has been referenced as the 5-number code. And by the time we get to spring of 1942, they haven't cracked it, but they've deciphered enough that they can get little bits of information.
Yeah, and that's huge.
It is huge.
Little bits at a time.
But little bits can also be very dangerous too.
Yeah, well, we're going to literally dive into that.
So, interesting story, and how all of this starts is that the guy that's in charge of this code breaking effort realizes that he deciphers this code enough to get these 2 letters, MO, and he puts 2 and 2 together and believes that the Japanese are going to be planning an attack at Port Moresby. He goes to Admiral Nimitz with this. Nimitz, to his credit, takes the man at his word and plans to move accordingly. Now, again, we're still in this area where we only have 4 carriers in the Pacific, and 1 is being refitted at this moment.
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful with these carriers, right?
Sure.
This is all we have. We don't have the destroyers. We barely have any submarines. Apparently, our torpedoes at this time are terrible.
Trash.
A lot of them aren't working. So really all we have are our carriers. But to his credit, Admiral Nimitz sends the USS Yorktown and the USS Lexington to the Coral Sea to handle this upcoming invasion of Port Moresby. And the Japanese are unaware of this. They do not know. Now, looking into how the Japanese are going to go about doing this, the Japanese early on in the war were guilty of making very complicated plans. Plans that if they worked would be great. But we've learned throughout history and a lot of the battles we've looked at that when you try to make things too complicated, it never plays out the way you want it to.
Keep it simple, right?
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of America Fog of War. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave us a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping us out and getting this show out to other people. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure you give this video a like. Also, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you stay up to date on all of our latest content. If you're looking for more of America Fog of War or just a way to help the show out, then please consider becoming a member over at our Patreon. For just $5 a month, you get early ad-free access to all of our content, as well as numerous other benefits, and it goes a long way in helping us maintain, honor, and uphold the legacy of the American warrior. Thank you so much, and as always, stay frosty. In a nutshell, and I'll try to find a map to put up to help for the people that are viewing this on YouTube at least see what we're talking about. But the Japanese invasion force is going to have a small carrier and then troop transports and a few destroyers and all that. Their goal is to get to Port Moresby. So they're going to be coming straight south from an island called Rabaul, and they're going to come around the eastern corner of New Guinea and hit Port Moresby. That's not all that's going to be involved in this invasion force, though. There's going to be a carrier force that's going to act. If you've heard any of our Civil War episodes, it's going to basically be acting like a cavalry screen. And a cavalry screen would move out in front of the infantry, hitting bridges and different crossing points to kind of keep the enemy guessing as to the movement of the main body behind that cavalry screen, right? If they can't get recon elements past that cavalry screen to see what the enemy force is doing, then you can end up surprising them. You can get behind them or maneuver to a better defensible position, whatever the case is. And that's kind of this carrier task force's job, the Japanese carrier task force. They will have 2 carriers, and those will be large, very strong battle class carriers. And their job is going to be to take the small island of Tulagi so that they can start setting up an airstrip from there. And then from there, they'll kind of move further east and south and swing wide back down past the Solomon Islands and then up again towards New Guinea, right? Keeping their forces separate so that it's a little harder to tell where they're going. Again, they have no clue that the Americans know they're heading for Port Moresby.
Right.
And that's all going to play very heavily into the confusion that will come.
So this is going to be putting the aircraft carriers, both American and Japanese aircraft carriers, unknown to each other in very close proximity of each other. So with these guys coming around the Solomon Islands, the American carriers, meanwhile, they're south of the Solomon Islands. They're between the Solomons and Australia, further south. Now, this sets up the stage for the world's first carrier battle ever. And I
can almost hear the Clint Eastwood. Boo, boo, boo.
Yeah, yes, like something's going way out.
It's like a Western showdown, like a high noon quick draw thing almost. Yeah. Dude, you can feel it coming. It's building towards that.
And really, whoever draws first has the major advantage,
right?
Because they're going to shoot first, they're going to launch first, and find the other guys first to actually strike their carriers and fleet there. Now, the Japanese invasion force, they captured Tulagi. This is going to be May 4th to the 5th. It's a very small island just north of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Now, the Yorktown alone is going to kind of like surprise these Japanese invaders on that island with a strike. And
well, let's get into that a little bit. Let's set the stage as to why. Now, the Lexington is sent to join the Yorktown. And we'll get into the commanders of the 2 different carrier groups here. They eventually combine into one task force.
Yeah.
But Admiral Fletcher is in charge of the Yorktown at this point.
Yes.
The Lexington has to refuel.
Yes.
So while that's refueling, he thinks, let me see where the enemy is and what they're doing, thinking that the Lexington's going to be able to link up with them very soon after.
Yeah.
Because they just need to finish refueling and then they can come and join.
Right. So he heads north and into the night of from the night of the 4th into the early morning hours of the 5th. They go up there, they launch planes and really kind of surprise that force there. And the Japanese are completely just caught off guard. Like, whoa, there's an aircraft carrier here. There's American fighters in the air.
Because again, up to this point, they had no clue.
They had no clue. They may have had an idea like something was somewhere, but not not about to be right on their, heels here.
Which Admiral Fletcher does get a little flack for this decision to
Yeah.
go attack Tulagi. But I think that at the time, given what he knew, it was a necessary decision to make. It also does take out some of their capabilities. I mean, they are successful in taking out some of the landing force that's assaulting Tulagi.
Yeah.
But he's given away the element of surprise.
He's given away the element of surprise, and at this time, he still does not know that 2 large aircraft carriers from Japan are coming around. They're still coming around the Solomon Islands. They still have no idea of that. They think what they're hitting is the only thing kind of in that area. So because of this, there's going to be obviously a lot of scouting. They're going to be looking for each other because they know each other's in the area, but where exactly? So Fletcher, he makes his attack and he kind of retires back further south, and they link up with join the aircraft carrier fleets again. And at this point, it's like Fletcher will, at this time, what they seem to find or scout or discover would be, let's head northwest towards Port Moresby, because that's where we think the invasion fleet's going to come from. We just kind of hit these guys up over here, and we're going to head this way. Meanwhile, these 2 Japanese carriers have made their way around the Solomon Islands, and they're behind the American fleet now. So these guys are scouting. Everybody's scouting. Everybody's got planes up in the air, looking around, listening, trying to figure out what's going on. They don't realize that at some point they're going to be only 70 nautical miles from one another.
Which, in naval terms, at least in this era, is close.
Very extremely close, and just have no idea of it because they're not expecting one another to be there.
That crazy.
It's
dude.
just a weird thing. The poor scouting, that we're going to get into that, because both sides, like you said earlier, with the listening to the operations and trying to break the codes and stuff, is going to play, not knowing that 100% is going to play a major role in how this is going to become very confusing with the scouting in the air and what they're going to see and report and what each side is doing. So,
well, that gets us into really what would be like the first contact between these two opposing sides.
Yeah.
And it's not actually going to happen between the two huge carrier task forces. It's actually going to happen between the Americans' carrier task force and the invasion force that's heading for Port Moresby. So before we get into this, it's important to kind of talk about the commanders, at least for the American side of this carrier task force. So at the time, you had, at least in naval slang, what's referred to as black shoe commanders and brown shoe commanders.
okay.
Now, black shoe commanders are going to be surface warfare knowledgeable, right? Their experience is going to be in battleships and destroyers and naval ship to naval ship combat.
Old school guys.
Actually, of the 4 carriers, there's only one that isn't a black shoe, and he would be what's called a brown shoe, and who's going to have experience as a naval aviator, and his expertise will actually be more in line with carrier fighting. His name is going to be Aubrey Jack Fitch. Fitch.
Okay, Fitch.
He's a naval aviator. He is in charge of the Lexington, and he ends up when these 2 carriers combine into one task force, he ends up being the air commander, essentially the naval air commander. He's in charge of tactically how to employ these air assets, whereas Admiral Fletcher is going to be in charge strategically of everything, right? So he makes the strategic decisions. Fitch will make the tactical decisions on how to employ these aircraft.
That's good.
That all being said, they're not the only aircraft that are going to be involved in this next part of the story. So there will be some Army aircraft that are coming off of Australia. And as they're flying towards Tulagi, they're going to see the Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby. Now, again, they're Army pilots. This is early in the war. They don't really know what they're looking at. So they call in that they see these massive Japanese aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
When in all actuality, it's a very small Japanese aircraft carrier that's just attached to this invasion force. It's not the same kind of aircraft carrier that is now behind the U.S.'s aircraft
Right,
task force,
right.
right? Aircraft carrier task force. When they call that in, at the same time, scouting planes from Admiral Fletcher's task force will be sent in that direction, and they will also see this invasion force. Now, because of a code error, right, and how they reported it, Admiral Fletcher thinks that is the big carriers, right? He thinks this is the main element.
Yeah.
And so he sends all of his aircraft. He's like, everybody, spin it up.
Go get
We're
'em.
going. There they are. We got them. We got the drop on them. And it's not until he already has them in the air that he realizes that isn't the case. The pilots that saw this, the invasion force, the Japanese invasion force, have made it back to the ship, and they're telling him, no, that's not what we were meaning to tell you. It's a small aircraft carrier with a few other ships. But they've already committed, right? So
Yeah.
Fletcher, he sends them on anyways. And this gets us into May 7th, which is going to be, like I said, the first clash between these two forces. So there will be 50 aircraft launched from the Lexington at 09:30 a.m., followed by another 43 aircraft from the Yorktown. So this is a massive assault.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when they get there, of course, they do not find two massive aircraft carriers. Instead, they find the light carrier Shoho. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
The
sure.
light carrier Shoho.
Mhm.
Now, again, she's supposed to provide air support for the invasion force. She's not meant really to fight aircraft carrier battles, right?
Yeah,
Like aircraft carrier on aircraft carrier. That's not what this thing is for. Needless to say, they've been given the command to go ahead. And so the Americans start diving on this Shoho, and they put a wallop on
Everybody
her, man.
wants a piece of this thing.
It's so for all these guys, this is their first taste of combat, right?
Yes.
This is early in the war. They are not experienced. And just like you and me, they are probably itching for it,
Chomping
right?
at the bit, ready.
I try to explain this to people all the time, but when you're new, all you want is that first taste of combat. We were actually talking about this the other day because when we went to Afghanistan, I started getting in contact. When I say this, it's like a few days before you did,
Yeah.
and you were telling me you were hearing it on the radio and going, "Man, we're never going to get it. We're just never going to get it."
That's what it felt like. Other squads are,
Everybody's getting it, and you're, man, I'm going to miss it. You know.
Yeah.
Well,
Made it all the way here.
needless to say, I can only imagine that these pilots feel the same way.
Yep.
So the Soho, now it's arguable whether or not the torpedo strikes actually hit it. It's reported that some 15 torpedoes hit the Soho. That doesn't seem to actually be the case. Again, at this time, American torpedoes were very, very defective. A lot of them didn't work. They didn't have very long range once you dropped them in the water. But that is kind of secondary because the U.S. dive bombers, which we'll get into in a second, are armed with 1,000-pound bombs.
Yeah.
And they hit this thing with 13 of them. 13,000-pound bombs on a small aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
Needless to say, the Shoho erupts and sinks within a matter of minutes, taking most of its crew with it.
Yep.
This is the first aircraft carrier that the Japanese has had sunk in this war, including all the fighting they've done up to this point.
Yep.
And just to throw it out there, it'll be 631 of her crew will go down with the ship. So that's a big chunk of Japanese sailors.
That's a lot.
Now, there'll be a lot of excitement, as I'm sure you remember from your first gunfight. You get back, everybody's high-fiving, they're excited, and your reports aren't probably going to be as accurate as they will be in the future. You see an explosion, you see the ship list a little bit from one side to the other, you see smoke, you think, hey, we just sunk this ship, we just did this. They're going to report back that they've done a lot more damage than what they actually have. But the one thing that does make it back is one aviator will radio back, scratch one flat top.
That's awesome.
And he is right in that. Right?
Yeah.
They did scratch off one flat top.
For sure.
Now, all that to be said, the whole objective of this battle, at least from the American perspective, is to deter an invasion of Port Moresby. Now, we'll get further into this, and ultimately, it will be the Battle of Coral Sea will be a Japanese tactical victory and an American strategic victory, and it's because of this point right here.
That's very interesting.
because this attack, even though it's against a smaller aircraft carrier, not really the main focal point of the tactical battle,
Yep.
it does deter the invasion force, because after that ship is sunk, the invasion force will turn around
Turns
and
them right
sail
around.
back to Rabaul.
Yeah.
Right? So objective accomplished.
Immediately. By accident.
Very early on in all this.
Yeah.
But that being said, this is just the first opening. You know, this is the first round of a 12-round fight.
Right.
So what happens next?
There's much more to go. So with the like you're saying, the poor scouting from American land-based bombers and also scouts in the air, the Japanese are going to also have a bout of poor scouting. And that same morning, Japanese scouts discover what they believe to be American carrier fleets at 7:22 in the morning. So the larger carriers coming around the back, like I said, on the eastern side, the Shukaku and the Zukaku, they turn into the wind by 8:15 and they launch 78 aircraft into the air. So they find instead the oiler USS Neosho accompanied by a destroyer. Now, it seems like not a lot, or very not important. However, there's a difference between oilers and tankers. Now, oilers are ships that can refuel the fleet while in motion. They call that underway replenishment.
Right. So while they're out at sea, they have the capability to refuel these aircraft carriers and other ships in the task force.
Keep everything moving. Now, a tanker is strictly like land-based. It goes from the mainland with tons of fuel. They go out, drop it off, deliver it to an island.
That's more about quantity, right?
Yeah,
they can take large quantities from point A to point B, but it's got to be dealt with in a port.
Yeah. Yep. It's got to be. Yep. So, needless to say, the Japanese, they don't touch them right away. They continue to kind of look for these carriers. They don't find the carriers, so they turn back on the Neosho and the destroyer. They sink they hit the Neosho numerous times with their bombs and torpedoes and everything, and sink that ship.
And a little tidbit: this is like it can be looked at as a blessing and a curse, because the U.S. at this time has very few oilers in their arsenal, and even more specifically, they have very few fast-paced oilers. Yeah. Whereas most oilers can barely get, I guess, 10 knots or something along those lines. This oiler is considered a fast oiler, and it can get up to 20 knots and, in theory, keep up with the fleet at higher speeds.
Yeah. Right?
Because that's their job. They roll with the fleet and refuel them as they go. Now, that's the bad outcome, right? That's the unfortunate, I don't know, result of all of this is we lose a very effective oiler.
Yeah.
The positive, though, is that it had just finished refueling the Lexington.
Yep.
Everybody's full of fuel, right? We're still ready to go. And it kept them away from finding the actual aircraft carriers.
Yes, this is true. I think hey might be a better idea to start. Hey, thanks for watching our show. If you're looking to get more out of America... Here we go. Hey, thanks for tuning in to America Fog... Hey, thanks for watching our show. If you're looking to get more out of America Fog of War, or if you're trying to get more of America Fog or are looking... Hey, thanks for tuning into our show. If you are looking to get more from America Fog of War, or are looking for a way to help us, or you're just looking to help... No, just. Recut. If you're trying to get... If you want more content from America Fog of War, or you're looking for a way to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon. Wait, a Patreon? It's a patron. Instead of consider becoming a Patreon, and consider joining our Patreon. Okay. For just $5 a month, you can... For just $5 a month, you can submit questions to be answered on air. Log into a monthly Zoom call with either Colby or myself to discuss related topics, to discuss U.S. military history or any topic related to it. and gain early ad-free access to all of our content. And gain early ad-free content to all of our content. And gain early ad-free content to all of our access content. And gain redo. Visit patreon.com/America Fog of War or click the link in our description and help us to maintain the legacy to help us honor the legacy of the American warrior. Hey, I'm not that good at this. If you like the show, join the Patreon for $5 a month. Thank you. Now, in addition to the Neosho going down, the destroyer, the Sims, was the name of her, and she was also sunk there. Now, both sides, I think at this point, are realizing that their scouting efforts need to get better at this, because each one now has launched planes and found something different than they expected out there. And by nightfall on the 7th, both American forces, without really seeing each other, but because of reports of these ships going down and everything, the American forces know that the Japanese carriers are behind them. And the Japanese forces, they realize, because of what happened to the Shoho, they realize that their carriers, the American carriers, are between the Japanese carriers and the Japanese invasion fleet. So it's like a thorn stuck in the side of, of the Japanese empire.
But they realize where each other are. That's the big thing, right? They know now, at least the general area. They don't have like a pinpoint location, but they have an idea. I think this is a good time to kind of inform the viewers and listeners of a few things. I think first we should kind of talk about what all is included in a carrier task force, and then maybe go into some of the different aircraft that those carriers employ.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we'll leave off at the night of the 7th. So the morning of the 8th is the big carrier battle. But what's all involved is in 1942, the carrier task force, as they called it, consisted of 1 or 2 aircraft carriers, 2 to 3 cruisers, 5 or 6 destroyers, and an oiler, sometimes 2.
And now we've already gone over what the oiler's job is.
Oiler's good for
the cruisers and the destroyers, though. Their main purpose is kind of to protect the carriers against an airborne threat, right? So if they encounter an enemy aircraft carrier, their job is to provide anti-aircraft fire for that carrier.
Yes, anti-submarine as well.
And yes, that's also very important.
Yes, because that's also a new not new, but
new word,
evolving threat.
Yeah,
at the time. Now, aboard, let's look at one task force. So aboard an aircraft carrier, you're going to have 4 squadrons. And the squadron consists, there's a fighter squadron, the bomber squadron, the scouts, and the torpedoes. So each one of them has a particular job. And so the fighters, they'll clear the skies. They'll go after other aircraft in the sky. The bombers, they're your dive bombers. So they're carrying massive payloads, and they're diving upon ships from 20,000 feet down to 1,500 feet.
Which is crazy, and they do it at a 70-degree angle. So you're talking, you're losing a lot of altitude.
Pick up
and
speed
they're
fast.
using the trajectory of their aircraft to kind of guide that bomb onto the target, right? I mean, you have aiming capabilities, but in this climate and at this time, coming from that high of an altitude to such a low altitude, a lot of the times they're bombing like what they would, like their viewfinder for their bombing, like their targeting system would fog up.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the times you're just kind of using your airplane as, all right, I think this is where it goes,
And eyeball that.
Kentucky windage, as we would call it in the Marine Corps.
Right. Yep. Kentucky windage. And now the scout planes, they kind of play a dual role. Now, let me go back real quick to the fighters. You're going to have the Grumman Wildcat as the fighters. And now the Dauntless, SPD Dauntless dive bomber is what you'll find as either the bomber squadron or the scout squadron. And they're going to have a pilot and a gunner, and they're going to have 2 1,000-pound bombs. They got 2 50 caliber machine guns, 2 30 caliber machine guns. So they're equipped for this dive bombing, and very quick, very swift planes. Now, the torpedo bombers, like we said, the torpedoes at this time in our American fleet were not very effective. These are larger planes. These are the Douglas TBD Devastators. And that's going to have one pilot, a bombardier, along with a radio man / rear gunner. Now, these torpedo bombers are a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier. They operate more at like a lower level altitude. So you're going to have with that either their aerial torpedoes weighed 1,935 pounds.
Yikes.
It's a big, hefty torpedo. They can substitute that for 1,000-pound bomb, or 3 500-pound bombs, or 12 100-pound bombs, depending on their mission. And they also, with the rear gunner, they have a 30 caliber rear machine gun at the top of that. So,
and this gets us into an interesting area. So, at this point in the war, the Japanese do have one leg up on us. They've been in conflict for a while before this. They've been at war for a while before this, and the one thing they have more dialed in than we do at the time is coordinating those various squadrons into an attack, right?
Yes.
Because the idea is, like you were saying, the fighters protect the rest of the squadrons from an aerial threat. The dive bombers are to dive. The torpedoes are come in at a low level, like 150 feet off the deck, right? Like low. And then when they get about 2,000 meters or 2,000 yards, I can't remember one of the. It's fairly close when you're considering what is going into this. They would drop their torpedoes and peel off. Yeah. Now, in a perfect world, you would have the dive bombers coming in, and simultaneously you would have torpedo bombers coming from the flanks of the ship from both sides. They call that an anvil attack, right? And the reason they do that is in theory, a Japanese ship can actually outrun a torpedo if it's able to turn and go full steam ahead. But if you're hitting it from both sides, whichever way it turns, it's out of luck, right?
Yeah.
And then it also plays into the threat. For instance, torpedo bombing, the best thing for the ship to do is to go fast so it can escape the torpedoes. But for a dive bomber, the best thing for the ship to be able to do is to go slow, to give your anti-aircraft gunners on board your ship enough time and a steadier target to hit, right? If you're going super fast, it's I would imagine it's like being in a Humvee, and if you're going fast, it's way harder to keep that machine gun on target versus slow.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what's the best case scenario out of two worst case scenarios, right? And if you put that much pressure on one ship, there's almost nothing they can do to avoid being hit.
Yeah.
That's in a perfect world. The U.S. is not good at coordinating that yet, but the one thing they will do is learn how to do that very quickly.
Yeah,
right?
Which is the most important part of any.
It is, especially considering that our ability to replenish our fighter pilots and our lost fighters and lost ships is so much greater than what the Japanese can do. If the it's what it's like. If you look at the American Civil War, it was way worse if the Confederacy lost troops, because it was that much harder for them to replace them. Whereas if the North lost troops, they still had so many more people they could take and pull into service, right? It's because of that industrial strength. Same thing with their weaponry. They just had that industrial might. That's the same thing you're looking at when you consider America versus Japan in this era. The Japanese don't have that capability. If they lose something, it's going to hurt them much worse than it does us.
The only difference is they actually have the trained pilots right now in action with experience, combat experience. Our guys, not so much.
Brand new.
Yeah. So, in any case, that's kind of the lineup. We got numerous ships, numerous aircraft carriers, numerous planes in the air, and different types of planes and pilots all going to be clashing. So all of the chaos is going to lead us to the morning of May 8th. And this is going to be after a week of kind of navigating through the skies and the seas upon each other, they're going to actually find each other. Now, the interesting part is, as I mentioned before, whoever launches first has the major advantage. So if you find them first, you launch first, you can hit first. The American fleet and the Japanese fleet find each other that morning on the 8th, almost simultaneously, within 15, 20 minutes apart. They're both going to launch planes, and they're going to, in some crazy world, pass each other through the skies. They're not going to intercept each other, but they're going to cross
pass
paths
by each other
in a way, yes, en route to hit each other's other ships. So now, American forces, of course, they found them first, and they launch only 15 minutes prior, like I said. And the Japanese, they're gonna get hit. Both sides are gonna get hit pretty bad, take some really bad lumps. Now, the Americans are gonna locate and attack. Commander there, his name is Takagi. Both of their ships. The Zukaku was kind of like, at the time, like in a rain squall or like in cloud cover, and was able to kind of stay out of the action for a moment. But her sister ship, the Shokaku, was the target for the American guys, and they hit it really hard, and with 3 1,000-pound bombs. So these dive bombers, they come in and they make contact immediately.
And it's important to stress again that the coordination between the various types of squadrons just isn't there yet, because from how I understand it, they don't all show up on scene at the same time.
Yeah.
And so they thus can't coordinate with each other. They locate this carrier, this Japanese carrier, at different times. I mean, not astronomically apart time-wise, but at different times. And again, the dive bombers, their gun sights are fogging up as they dive on their target, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that we did get 3 hits is pretty freaking impressive when you consider that. If you've ever tried to shoot through a rifle with the optic fogged up,
right,
it ain't easy. And I can't imagine putting a big freaking engine on it and going really fast towards the ocean makes it any easier.
You got to watch your altitude. You got to watch everything.
There's so many things going on, and you're trying to aim with a fogged up lens.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on there that's very complicated.
So this ship, the Shokaku, is damaged terribly. It's on fire. He's unable to recover the aircraft that have been launched already. And so with that, they also took 223 dead or wounded upon that ship and was ordered to retire. So that ship is like, I'm out of here. I got to get back to Japan. And later that afternoon, the Zukaku, the other remaining carrier is going to recover both aircraft carriers' planes. On the American side of things, with our ships, like I said, simultaneously, so American aircraft have hit the Japanese fleet. Now, within 15 minutes, it's all happening on the same side here. Now, the Yorktown and the Lexington, they come under attack by Japanese planes at 11:13 a.m. The Yorktown is going to take pretty bad hits at first. She's going to receive 1 bomb hit and a near miss that's going to like explode in the water next to the ship, and it like basically rips her open at the seams.
And that one direct hit, from what I understand, went straight through the landing deck.
Yes.
Like there's a photo, if you look it up, there's a photo of someone underneath it that takes a picture and you can just see sky, which is crazy.
Absolutely crazy. Now, the pilots in the air, upon returning from the American pilots, they can see the Yorktown as the Yorktown's hit, but it's still continuing to sail and operate. There's a big trail of oil behind it. So it's like, can't miss it from the sky if you're a friendly or enemy pilot. Still able to maneuver the seas. Now, the Lexington, at that same time, she receives 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits. Now, at first, it seemed like the Lexington was going to pull through this because she was still cruising like 24 knots, like as if nothing had happened, like damage control, firefighters are managing certain issues. However, not going to be the case. So both sides at this point have discovered one another, launched planes,
hit one another,
and now they're kind of, at this point, damage assessment. Let's assess our casualties. Let's get our planes back on the deck.
You know what it makes me think of? You ever seen a fight like in high school where 2 kids fight each other and each one gets a good lick in and then they realize, I'm kind of done with this.
Yeah.
Like that's been enough pain for one day.
Yeah.
That's almost the vibe I get for the end of this battle.
Right.
Like both sides are like, that's enough. I don't need to see how much further we can take this.
It's a good comparison because the Japanese, they're going to lose a lot more pilots than the Americans are.
And it's funny you bring that up because it's a point that I've been kind of holding on to. I want to make when these attacks happen. Again, we've talked about the Americans' fault at being new and inexperienced and not being able to coordinate their various squadrons in the attack, whereas the Japanese are a little more effective at that, hence why they get the 2 torpedo strikes and the bomb strikes on the Lexington. But where the Americans do excel is in their anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese seem almost ineffective completely in their anti-aircraft fire when our planes and squadrons attack their ships. On the other side of things, the American ships seem very effective with their anti-aircraft fire, which is interesting because the day before this is something we haven't mentioned yet, Admiral Fletcher has sent the majority of his destroyers and cruisers with an Australian naval commander towards Port Moresby to make sure that that invasion fleet doesn't continue on with its mission.
Risky.
So their strong anti-aircraft capability isn't even with them. Whatever they're doing from pretty much from the aircraft carriers themselves.
Yeah.
And they knock serious numbers of these Japanese pilots out of the sky. Hey guys, just wanted to take a quick second to let you know a little bit more about America Fog of War and what we're trying to do with this channel. See, Brett and I both are Marine Corps combat veterans from the global war on terror. We fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We've also had an intense interest in the history of the American warrior. Now, it would be a lie to say that our opinions aren't somewhat biased, but after all of the study, the research, and things that we've seen with our own eyes, we are both confident that the greatest warrior the world has ever known is the American warrior. Whether we're talking about the American patriots that gained our independence from Great Britain, the blue-clad federal troops that won a victory at Gettysburg, or the Marines that raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, all of them have distinguished themselves far and above what's normally expected of a nation's warrior class. Citizen soldiers that have been willing to sacrifice all upon the altar of freedom. And today, that legacy seems somewhat threatened. It is our goal here to continue telling their stories, to uphold their legacy so that they're never forgotten, and that future generations of American warriors have ideals and standards to strive to reach. Thank you for your support, and as always, stay frosty.
Yeah, like for this one, in this attack, the Japanese had launched 69 planes, and only 46 of them had returned.
Yikes.
Now, out of those 46, once they landed on that other aircraft carrier that was accepting all the return flights, they ended up having to push dozens of them off.
Because you only got so much room.
Yeah, they're running out of room. It's like, well, salvage, can't salvage that, get it off. And so, yeah, the Japanese took major hit to their planes and pilots in this first go around.
That's important to point out because we've already mentioned before that the U.S. has this capability that the Japanese doesn't, which is to replenish its pilots and its equipment, its aircraft, and by the end of the war, its aircraft carriers. The Japanese just don't have that. So when they lose that many pilots and aircraft, they can't replenish that, right? I mean, They do to a certain extent, but they can't keep up with the replenishment rate that the U.S. has. We're just getting into this. The Japanese have already been at war for a minute, right?
Right.
And they're stretched very thin. They're stretched very thin. I mean, part of the reason they had to go to war with us in the first place is because we weren't giving them any more oil and gas, right? So like they're in a hurting
Time crunch, absolutely.
Now let's get into the fate of the Lexington. At 12:47, as a result of cracked aviation fuel tanks, the Lexington suffers an explosion below deck. And at 13:55, that'd be 1:55 p.m. for those not using military time, she signaled that her fires, she couldn't put out the fires. So not too long after that, there will be another explosion, and then followed by a third explosion. So something is going on inside of that ship. It's
out of control.
It's out of control. They can't get the fires under control. It's catching other things on fire. Fuel tanks are cracked. They're exploding. I would imagine that the ammunition, the ammunition supply probably catches fire as well. Needless to say, at 5:07 p.m., the admiral comes over the ship's intercom and tells everybody to abandon ship. She's sinking.
Just jump into the Pacific Ocean now. That's
Yep.
got to feel terrible.
Dude, that'd be scary. Also, if you have to jump, you know how high up that is? I don't know how they get everybody off the ship, but I was thinking about it, looking at pictures while doing research. I'm like, if those poor jokers had to jump, that is a long fall.
Yeah.
Like if you don't hit the water right, break all the bones in your body, kind of a long fall.
Yeah.
You know, because water does not feel good if you hit it from a distance.
Definitely not. Pencil dive.
But needless to say, the Lexington's going to be scuttled shortly after that, sunk in the Pacific.
Bummer.
But there is a bright side. Although the Yorktown is damaged and damaged pretty thoroughly, it is able to limp back to Pearl Harbor. This is crucial right here. The Japanese and the Americans take two very different approaches in the way they repair their aircraft carrier, and it's going to play in the future Battle of Midway in a very, very, very important way. The Yorktown is sent back to Pearl Harbor and is repaired and refitted in 3 days' time.
That's incredible.
And then sent right back out to sea, right? On top of that, all the aircraft and pilots that the Yorktown had lost, there was an argument that they should either send those pilots and those aircraft to bases and make them be, land-based aircraft that protect bases in the Pacific. Instead of doing that, Admiral Nimitz is able to argue that no, they're the only trained and experienced aircraft carrier pilots we have, though they need to be on that ship. So what they end up doing is they end up taking planes and pilots from the USS Saratoga, which is back at Washington, being refitted itself, and send them to the Yorktown. And that's how they get an air group. And that air group will play a very, very strategic role in the upcoming Battle of Midway. Whereas the Japanese, when they send their aircraft carrier back to be refitted, do the opposite. They, instead of pulling from another aircraft carrier to supplement their existing aircraft carrier, they decide not to do that. And they wait. And they end up going to Midway with less aircraft carriers than they probably could have had.
Yeah.
So it really plays out to our benefit. Now, all that being said, we made the point that this battle was a tactical victory for the Japanese. And if you look at the numbers, it makes sense. Now, numbers-wise, we actually caused more casualties on the Japanese than they did on us.
Yeah.
But when you look at the tools of warfare, right? So these massive aircraft carriers that are they're the most important asset you have in the Pacific theater, at least in naval warfare. They took out one of our big ones. We just damaged one of theirs. The little one we took out, the Shoho, was vital in getting our objective accomplished, but it doesn't really hurt their might, if that makes sense.
Right.
All that to be said, strategically, it's a win for the U.S. because if you look at the high water mark, right, the furthest the Japanese expansion makes it, it doesn't ever go past that northern line on New Guinea. They never are able to secure Port Moresby because they were deterred at the Battle of Coral Sea.
That's important.
It's very important because if that would have happened, things probably looked a lot different in the Pacific theater.
Yeah, the war could have gone on much longer than it originally did. Something else I want to mention that I didn't mention earlier, the Japanese aircraft carriers, the one that was hit early on. I mentioned earlier the one carrier was like covered by cloud cover and all that stuff. Later on, she was eventually struck by American pilots, but not sunk or anything. So, the Japanese had a lot of work to put in to repair these things. And like you said, it just wasn't done quick enough in any event. Because I don't want to get too far into it because I don't want Midway to, even though Midway does overshadow the Coral Sea, the American ships are still outnumbered at Midway anyway, even with the carriers being out of service on both sides.
Well, it also
plays a role.
It's also super important to realize that the Battle of Coral Sea is a major learning milestone for the U.S. And the way they employ their aircraft in the Battle of Midway shows how much they learned from the Battle of Coral Sea.
Yeah.
That whole thing we're talking about coordinating the various squadrons. They don't do it that well at Coral Sea, but it's from what they learned at Coral Sea that makes them able to do it better at the Battle of Midway.
And also, that's a good point. And also, the Japanese learned something as well, too, is that American aviators are no joke.
Right.
They're not just like going to run over everybody like they've been doing.
Yeah,
and all
because
of a sudden, it's a good matchup, and they're taking hits,
casualties.
taking casualties a lot.
The Japanese have this confidence at this era of the war because they've been steamrolling everybody.
Yeah.
But it's about this time where that confidence is going to shift. At this point in the war, we're kind of hoping and praying things work out for us. But it's not too long after this engagement that things shift, and the confidence is on our side of the court and stays on our side of the court till the end of the war.
Yeah.
Because at this point, this and then the Guadalcanal campaign after that, there really is no stopping the U.S. military across the Pacific.
Yeah.
We have very, very costly engagements, and the Japanese put up stiff resistance, but they don't ever stop us from that point on, It's interesting how this stuff plays out. It also is interesting to see how the first major battles of a particular type play out. You can look at different wars and see this as well. We've made a few Civil War references. When you think back to like the first Battle of Manassas, it's chaos on both sides.
Yeah.
And the fact that the South come away with the victory really falls down to one unit, and they're pretty much broken by the time the rest of the Confederate Army gets there to be able to help them out. You know what I mean? And both sides are feeling around in the dark for each other. You can say the same thing is happening here. It's all about learning, because every time, we mention this often. The instruments of warfare have changed over time, but the combat experience remains the same.
Yeah.
One thing that does not remain the same is the way you fight the war, right? Because the instruments are changing.
Yeah.
World War I is not the same as World War II. World War II is not the same as Vietnam. Vietnam is not the same as the Gulf War. The Gulf War is not the same as OIF, OEF, right? Things change, and the way you fight them change. Now you look at the fighting going on in Ukraine, where drones are being used, and they have, where it's like this weird mix of World War I trench warfare, but with a very modern twist on it. Things are changing constantly on the battlefield. And what is really unique, especially from the U.S.'s perspective, every country does this, but I feel that this is something the U.S. does exceptionally well. We're always trying to figure out how the next war is going to be fought. And even if we're wrong, as soon as that war starts, we are very quick to figure out how to fight it. And you see that play out in this battle. To how this battle plays out to the Battle of Midway, right? From the transition from this one to that one, we learn at a very quick rate, because there are people specifically focused on how to make that better, and the guys that are in the field doing it they're you have to imagine that they're being brutally honest in their after action reports and having these conversations. What do we do right? What do we do wrong? How can we make it better? The top level special forces guys say that's their favorite thing about those units, whether it's SAS, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6. They talk about it being the ultimate professional environment, and that nobody gives you a pat on the back. You finish a mission and it's right back to business. All right, what do we do wrong and how can we make it better? You have to think that these guys were doing the same thing, and that's the only way that they were able to learn how this war was going to be fought at such a quick pace.
Yeah, advancements during wartime is huge in comparison to any other advancement that we make during any other time period. So, yeah, I think the Battle of Coral Sea in May of 1942 is, it probably doesn't seem like that quick, but it is very quick. It's only 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So they're doing pretty good, I'd say.
Yep, things are starting to change. Because up to this point, the Japanese have been winning everything.
Yeah.
Maybe except if you count the Doolittle raid.
We had a Doolittle raid, yeah. Don't forget about that little
pinprick.
Yep, right in the heart.
But that brings us to the conclusion of this story. It's kind of a quicker episode. I can assure you that the next episode is probably going to be a little more in depth. There's a lot more written about Midway. There's a lot more, and it won't be as confusing. This battle is kind of tough because it is all over the place. There's things that we didn't talk about. There's things that we probably talked about excessively. We were trying to paint a very clear picture, at least from a bird's eye view of what's happening at this battle. Needless to say, I enjoyed it.
Me too. Me
Cool,
too.
man.
It's important. It's important. So, but which, just like where we just came from, now we're here. We're going to be moving on to the next
Exactly.
scenario, and it's all very important in the early Pacific days and weeks and months of the World War II.
It is indeed. Well, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please make sure you subscribe to the show and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out a lot. If you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you subscribe, click the notification bell, and give the video a like. We really appreciate it. And if you really enjoy the show and want to find another way to support us, you could always come over and be a patron on our Patreon. It's $5 a month. It's very affordable. We give you early access and ad-free access to all of our episodes, early access to extra things that we work on, like our short docs. And we're constantly coming up with new and exciting things to be able to give our patrons because of the support they give us. And it helps tremendously. So thank you all for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. And until next time, stay frosty.